In my previous video that I would touch again on why the North and South, the big differences between the Northern and Southern colonies. I don't believe I've explained that in chapter 7, and that's the only chapter that you've been part of the class for, so I'll just say it again. When the colonies were established, obviously their ability to earn money, their ability to turn their livelihood into a business, was dependent on where they settled. And in the South, you had very rich, fertile lands, especially the tide lands, where they were able to grow tobacco and corn, rice, indigo, eventually cotton. And so agriculture did very well in the colonies below Maryland. The middle colonies were also very good for agriculture. They were predominantly wheat providers. They had great rivers. They could. They also had vast woodlands, so they could kind of straddle both the northern and southern economies with what they could provide. However, in the north, they could not provide um, enough to in farming that would allow them to make a business of it. They did subsist, which means they did enough farming to provide the vegetables and the food they needed for their families alone. But they couldn't go and sell it. They didn't make enough. The ground was rocky, the growing season was short. In the north, you get the fall and winter temperatures drop much sooner than they do in an area like Delaware or even south of Delaware. We stay warmer and can potentially stay warm all through the winter months, whereas in the winter months in the north, they're pretty well guaranteed snow. And because of the shorter growing season, the rocky soil, it was not a climate that would allow for the northern colonies to develop an agricultural economic system. So they had to go to something else. So they turned to fishing. They had turned to lumber. And from lumber, they went into shipbuilding and they also went into furniture making. So being a much, you know, industrial based economy, they gravitated to the industrial revolution. They gravitated towards the advancements in industrial machinery, such as factories and any kind of invention that would streamline the production of wood and fish and so on. So the North was full of industry and technology of that time, and the South was full of farms. So obviously, a farm cannot guarantee the kind of crop it's going to have. It's guaranteed on how much rain it gets, how much of sun the plants get. So if you have a good growing season, you have a bountiful crop, then you'll bring in a good amount of money. But if you have a drought and not enough rain, or in the opposite, too much rain, and your fields get flooded, then you don't grow anything at all. So, of course, banks would favor an industrial loan versus an agricultural loan because an industrial loan was not dependent on weather forces that man couldn't control. Industrial loans could be easily paid back. There was a guarantee that it was a good investment to give industrial businesses loans, whereas agricultural loans, they were a little skeptical. They weren't sure that farmers would be able to pay back their loans. So Thomas Jefferson feared that this national bank would favor northern industry over the southern farms and plantations. However, a compromise is reached, and the compromise said that if the national capital would move from New York City to a more localized location that would straddle both the northern and southern territories, that the southern states would approve the national bank. And so that compromise said that for 10 years, the national capital would move to Philadelphia while the new capital was being built. Maryland and Virginia would voluntarily give up sections of their land for this new capital, and that this new capital would be called Washington, D.C., or the Washington in the District of Columbia. So, and both obviously the name honoring our first president, as well as Christopher Columbus, who was considered the man who to discover America. Hamilton's financial plan did work, and everyone was happy. Foreign powers were happy because they were finally getting their loans repaid. And however, because of Hamilton and Jefferson's differing political views, it gave birth to our two-party political system. And at the very beginning, we had the parties of the Federalists, and then the Anti-Federalists changed their name to the Democratic Republicans. So now we have an issue with, I told you, part of Hamilton's plan was to impose an excise tax, and that this was going to give rise to a conflict within our country, and that conflict was called the Whiskey Rebellion. The reason why this was such a problem for American citizens was before we established our constitutional government, back when we were underneath the Confederation, and you had states and the Confederation printing their own money, and the economic system being flooded with a lot of worthless bills, some people took to bartering. And bartering means that it's an exchange of goods or services. So if I need, a dozen eggs, I could trade you for a gallon of milk. And that would be bartering. So one of the popular bartering items was whiskey, especially with the citizens who lived in the West, the settlers who had moved west from the colonies. They had taken to using whiskey as a form of money, and they would barter for livestock, natural resources like maybe lumber that they needed to build their barn. And the problem with the excise tax is that even though you may have exchanged whiskey for something else, the federal government still expected that the tax on whiskey be paid in cash. So if you're in a bartering situation and you've used whiskey to get, well, let's say you barter whiskey so you could get a new plow for your farm, not only are you still going to are you out the whiskey, but you also have to dwindle your cash resources by still paying this tax. So as is the case for a lot of people, when the government affects their bank account, people became very combative and very upset. So when the federal government sent their tax collectors and their federal officers to start collecting this tax, these federal officers were met with resistance to the point of where the farmers in Western Pennsylvania attacked and burned down property. They actually tarred and feathered, and that may not be a practice you're familiar with, Howard, but tarring and feathering basically is you took a person, you put them in a vat of hot tar, and then you douse them in chicken feathers. So it could, depending on how hot the tar was, it could be very harmful. And at the absolute least of the punishment, it was embarrassing. And obviously, tar is very sticky, and it would have required the person to shave, you know, all their hair off, because they would have been doused from head to toe in this. And it could go either to the extreme of causing bodily harm to the minimum of causing embarrassment and extreme inconvenience of getting this tar off of you. But it was just not a nice experience for anyone involved. So was it should, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking right. So when George Washington heard about this revolt, this rebellion, he went to the governor of Pennsylvania and said, all right, so you're going to take care of this for us, right? And the governor said, nope, I don't think I'm going to get involved. And so then Washington said, okay. So he then sends out some another group of federal officers, and these go to the farmers who have been causing all the havoc, and they say, you know what? Look, if you'll just pay the tax and stop messing with, the people who were sent from the government to collect the taxes, we'll let everything slide. We'll forgive you. There'll be no repercussions. There'll be no penalties. You won't go to jail. You won't pay for anything. Just stop what you're doing, do what is right, and everything can go back to normal. And the farmers in Western Pennsylvania said, yeah, we don't think so. We don't want to pay this tax, and we're not going to pay this tax. We think it's unfair, and if you continue to send federal officers out here to collect the tax, we will do to them like what we did to the first tax collectors. So when Washington heard about their response, he said, okay, you know what? I'm not messing around anymore. And he put on his army uniform. He got on a horse and he led the 13,000 troops all the way to Western Pennsylvania himself. And when the farmers found out that he was coming, they put down all of their weapons. They went home, and not one shot was fired. And the revolt was put down, and the Western farmers started paying their tax. There was no compromise. The federal government didn't repeal the tax. The tax stayed in place, but the farmers were obviously daunted. Here comes George Washington, the general of our Continental Army and the military leader of our government, and he's bringing soldiers, and we could be killed if we don't stop what we're doing. And so it was a peaceful resolution to this whiskey revolt. But the important precedent that George Washington established was his commitment to enforce the law. And as I said to you in the first video, our government did not know what to do with a president. Many wanted the president to be a figurehead. If you watch the video that was posted on your Google Classroom, you will see where George Washington actually went to Congress one day with a list of bills and business that he thought that Congress needed to address. He was there to participate in the discussion and in the working of the Congress. And basically he was told, you have no place here, go back to your home. And that angered him. And from that point on, he never went back to Congress with any of his ideas or things he wanted to see happen in the country. So again, George Washington, even in this, established another precedent for how our president would conduct themselves when you had a skirmish inside a state. And we saw this happen this summer. You may not have seen it, but with all of the riots that happened, Donald Trump would go to the mayors of the cities